If you're Gen X, or if you were raised by Gen X, this video is going to feel uncomfortably accurate. And if this topic already hits close to home, tap like now so this reaches the people who need to hear it. Generation X learned one rule very early in life. Don't complain, don't expect help, figure it out yourself. Not because they were cold, not because they didn't care, but because the world quietly taught them that this was the safest way to survive. Gen X grew up in a psychological gap between generations. Their parents believed in structure, authority, and emotional restraint. Their children would later be encouraged to express, explore, and question everything. Gen X was stuck in the middle, old enough to remember analog life, young enough to be forced to adapt to digital chaos. But the most important thing about Gen X isn't technology, it's emotional self-reliance. Many Gen X kids came home to empty houses. Both parents worked. Divorce rates were rising. Latchkey kids wasn't a label, it was normal life. You didn't text your parents. You didn't call to say you arrived home safely. You just handled it. And when you fell emotionally, there often wasn't anyone there to catch you. So you learned to regulate yourself early. You learned to not ask too many questions. You learned to not be a problem. Psychologically, this creates a very specific adaptation: independence before emotional safety. That sounds admirable, but it comes with a cost. Gen X didn't learn to process emotions out loud. They learned to contain them, to delay them, to joke them away, to push through. If something hurt, you distracted yourself. If something scared you, you minimized it. If something felt overwhelming, you told yourself, "I'll deal with it later." And most of the time you did. This is why Gen X is often described as resilient, sarcastic, tough, and practical. But underneath that competence is a nervous system that learned early, no one is coming to rescue you. That belief becomes internalized, and once it does, it shapes everything. It shapes how you work, how you love, how you handle stress, how you age. Gen X doesn't collapse easily. They endure, they function, they adapt. But endurance is not the same as health. Here's something rarely talked about. Gen X often doesn't recognize emotional distress as distress. They recognize it as life. Anxiety feels like responsibility. Burnout feels like adulthood. Emotional exhaustion feels like something to push through, not something to examine. And because they learned early not to externalize pain, they often don't have the language for it later. If you've ever heard a Gen X person say things like, "Others have it worse. It's not a big deal. I'll be fine. That's just how it is." That's not emotional avoidance. That's emotional conditioning. Psychology shows us that children adapt not to what is ideal, but to what is required. And what Gen X required was self-management. They didn't grow up being asked, "How do you feel?" They grew up being asked, "Did you do what you were supposed to do?" So competence became currency. Reliability became identity. And this is where Gen X becomes fascinating psychologically, because they are not motivated by validation the way younger generations are, and not motivated by duty the way older generations were. They're motivated by survival logic. Does this work? Does this solve the problem? Does this keep things stable? Emotion comes second. This also explains their complicated relationship with authority. Gen X grew up watching institutions fail in real time: political scandals, economic instability, broken promises. They learned not to trust systems, only skills. So they became adaptable, skeptical, flexible. They don't expect fairness, they expect reality. That's why Gen X humor is often dark, ironic, and self-deprecating. Humor becomes a pressure valve, a way to say something is wrong without openly saying it hurts. If this resonates with you so far, pause for a second and comment Gen X below. Not for the algorithm, but so people know they're not alone in this experience. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Gen X often appears emotionally distant, but not because they don't feel deeply. In fact, many of them feel intensely. They just learned that expressing emotion doesn't change outcomes. So, instead of sharing emotions, they solve problems. Instead of talking through pain, they compartmentalize it. Instead of asking for help, they become the helper. This creates a strange paradox later in life. Gen X is often the most reliable person in the room, but the least likely to receive support. They're the ones people lean on, but rarely lean back on. And over time, that imbalance shows up in the body. Psychosomatic symptoms, chronic tension, unexplained fatigue, a sudden emotional crash in midlife. Because emotions that aren't processed don't disappear, they relocate. This is why many Gen X adults experience burnout later than millennials, but hit it harder when it arrives. They've been running on emotional efficiency for decades, and efficiency has a limit. Another key trait of Gen X psychology is emotional privacy. They don't like being watched while struggling. Vulnerability feels exposed, not relieving. That's why therapy, self-help language, and emotional openness sometimes feel foreign or uncomfortable to them, not because they reject it, but because it wasn't modeled. They weren't taught to narrate their inner world, they were taught to manage it silently. And when younger generations say things like, "Just talk about how you feel," Gen X often thinks, "Why? What will that change?" That question isn't cynicism, it's lived experience. But here's the part most people miss. Gen X actually understands emotional reality very well. They just express it indirectly. Through humor, through work ethic, through consistency, through showing up. They may not say, "I love you" often, but they'll be there when it matters. They may not talk about anxiety, but they'll quietly remove obstacles for others. They may not describe burnout, but they'll carry weight no one else notices. And that's why Gen X is often misunderstood. They don't perform emotion, they contain it. But containment, over time, becomes compression. And compression eventually needs release. That's where we'll go next. Because in the second half of this video, we'll talk about what happens when Gen X finally slows down and why emotional reckoning often comes later in life for this generation. We'll also talk about how Gen X relates to millennials and Gen Z psychologically, and why so much tension between generations isn't conflict, but misinterpretation. For many people in Generation X, the most difficult moment in life isn't youth. It's not early adulthood. It's the moment when life finally slows down and there's no noise left to hide behind. For decades, Gen X stayed busy. Work, family, responsibility, survival. Constant movement kept the emotional system regulated. But when the pace changes, when kids grow up, careers stabilize, or the body starts asking for rest, something unexpected happens. The thoughts get louder. This is often the first time Gen X is forced to sit with emotions they postponed for years. Not because they avoided them, but because there was never time to feel them safely. Psychologically, this is called delayed emotional processing. When emotions aren't acknowledged in real time, they don't disappear. They wait, and they tend to resurface when external pressure drops. That's why many Gen X adults report something confusing. "I did everything right. Why do I feel empty now? Why am I tired when life is finally stable? Why am I anxious now, not when things were harder?" The answer is simple, but uncomfortable. Your nervous system finally feels safe enough to feel. Gen X was trained to function first and feel later, but later always comes due. This is why midlife can feel emotionally disorienting for this generation. Not dramatic, not explosive, but quietly unsettling. They're not falling apart. They're finally slowing down enough to notice what's been held inside. And this often shows up not as sadness, but as restlessness, irritability, fatigue, a sense of disconnection from things that used to matter. Because Gen X doesn't frame emotional pain as pain, they frame it as inefficiency. Something feels off, motivation drops, tolerance shortens. But instead of asking, "What am I feeling?" they ask, "What's wrong with me?" This is where generational misunderstanding deepens. Younger generations often interpret Gen X as emotionally unavailable or resistant to growth. But the reality is more subtle. Gen X doesn't resist emotions, they resist disruption. They learned early that emotions didn't stop responsibility. Bills still had to be paid, work still had to be done, people still depended on them. So emotional expression felt impractical. But practicality doesn't erase emotional needs, it just delays them. This is also why Gen X often struggles with modern mental health language. Not because they don't believe in it, but because it feels abstract. They're used to concrete problems and concrete solutions. Tell them, sit with your feelings, and it feels vague. Tell them, here's what this feeling is doing to your body, and they lean in. Gen X is deeply embodied, even if they don't talk about it that way. That's why stress shows up physically for this generation. Back pain, jaw tension, headaches, digestive issues, sleep problems. The body becomes the spokesperson for emotions that never learn to speak. And here's something important that rarely gets said. Gen X didn't grow up in a culture of reassurance, they grew up in a culture of realism. No one told them everything would be okay, they were told to be prepared if it wasn't. So optimism feels suspicious. Excessive positivity feels naive, and emotional language can feel performative. This creates friction with millennials and Gen Z who were encouraged to verbalize inner experiences more openly. To Gen X, it can sound like complaining. To younger generations, Gen X can sound dismissive. But neither side is wrong, they're speaking different emotional dialects. Gen X speaks through action. Younger generations speak through articulation. Understanding this alone dissolves a lot of tension. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood traits of Gen X, detachment. Gen X often appears detached not because they don't care, but because caring without control feels dangerous. If you learned early that expressing emotion didn't change outcomes, you stop investing emotionally where you have no leverage. So Gen X learns to conserve emotional energy. They don't get overly excited, they don't catastrophize easily, they don't externalize panic. This can look like apathy, but it's actually emotional budgeting. And it's why Gen X often performs extremely well in crises. They've been training for instability their entire lives. But emotional budgeting has a downside. It limits joy the same way it limits pain. When you learn to stay neutral to survive, emotional peaks become unfamiliar and sometimes uncomfortable. That's why some Gen X adults struggle to fully enjoy rest, pleasure, or stillness. The nervous system associates calm with vulnerability. Movement feels safer than presence. If this resonates with you, comment "This makes sense" below. Not to label yourself, but to acknowledge something you might never have put into words before. Now here's the part that deserves more compassion. Gen X often became emotionally fluent only when they became parents. Raising millennials and Gen Z forced them to confront emotions they never had permission to explore themselves. They were asked questions they never learned to answer. They were exposed to vulnerability they were taught to suppress. And many of them tried, awkwardly, imperfectly, to do better. That's why Gen X parents can feel contradictory, emotionally distant at times, deeply protective at others. They didn't inherit emotional tools, they had to build them while already exhausted. So if you're younger and you felt misunderstood by Gen X, it's not because they don't care, it's because they were learning emotional language in adulthood. That's late, and it's hard. Now let's talk about healing, in a way that actually fits Gen X psychology. Gen X doesn't heal through constant emotional excavation, they heal through integration. They don't need to relive everything, they need to understand it. When Gen X understands why they are the way they are, self-judgment softens, shame drops, tension eases. Because suddenly it's not something wrong with me, it's something that happened to me. That reframe alone is powerful. And the most important realization for Gen X is this: you don't lose your strength by acknowledging emotion, you refine it. Emotional awareness doesn't make you fragile, it makes you precise. You don't have to become expressive like younger generations, you just have to stop carrying everything alone. Small changes matter. Naming stress before the body does, resting without guilt, allowing support without feeling weak. These are not personality changes, they're nervous system updates. And here's the final truth. Generation X was shaped by absence of supervision, of reassurance, of safety nets. So they became strong. But strength was never meant to be permanent armor. It was meant to be temporary protection. You're allowed to set it down now. If this video helped you see yourself or someone you love more clearly, subscribe. This channel is about understanding the psychology behind who we are, not blaming generations for surviving the best way they knew how. I'll see you in the next one.